What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Joshua Landis, the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, who was brought up in Beirut, Lebanon, and has lived over 14 years in the Middle East. I brought Joshua back on the podcast today to discuss two possible futures for the Middle East. The first will be defined by perpetual conflict, insecurity, and the specter of nuclear proliferation. The second would be defined by a tenuous, albeit hopeful peace built on compromise and regional security. Professor Landis explains why he believes that this choice is now upon us, and that we are at a turning point in the Middle East that provides us with a glimpse into what the future of this conflict-ridden region will look like and how it will fit into the larger global security order or disorder that is currently emerging. Between the first and second hours of this conversation, we discuss the implications of the ongoing war in Lebanon, the Israeli war and occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, the future of the Palestinian movement for independent statehood, the rightward shift in Israeli politics, the status of the Abraham Accords, and the prospects for a new security arrangement and partnership between the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia that could result in a historic reset of the political and economic status quo in this still vital region of the world. If you want access to all of today's conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly provocative and thoughtful conversation with my guest, Dr. Joshua Landis. Joshua Landis, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Demetri, it's a pleasure to be on with you again.
It's fantastic having you on, Dr. Landis. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Are you back home in Oklahoma now?
I am. I'm in Oklahoma City, where I live, and I teach at the University of Oklahoma, which is in Norman, Oklahoma.
So you're the director of the Center for Middle East Studies or Politics there. So you also teach classes still?
I do. I teach, and I'm director of two centers, the Iran Center and a Center for Middle East Studies.
What are the courses that you're teaching this semester?
This semester, I am teaching a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict, actually, a graduate class on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And next semester, I'll be teaching international relations in the Middle East, and I'll actually be going to Italy to teach a little bit there.
Oh, fantastic. So look, I brought you on because I wanted to revisit some of the things that we spoke about in our last two episodes, which were geared more towards Syria, the withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East, the breakdown in the rules-based international order, and its implications for the region. That's the backdrop, with the immediate context in this case being the Israeli war in Gaza, Israel-Palestine, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran, the proxies, all of that. You published a thread on Twitter a little more than a week after the now infamous Israeli pager attacks, and a few days after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, with 5 key takeaways for your followers, and I would say especially for the Arab world. Can you walk us through some or all of these and tell my listeners and I why you think they're important for followers of this conflict to understand?
Well, yes. I mean, at first, very simply, the pager incident in which close to 4,000 Hezbollah members and family members and others had their pager blown up in their hand, and it wounded many of them very badly. I mean, we saw pictures in the hospitals of people without hands, blind, their faces had been completely filled with shrapnel. And it killed a number of the top people. And then their phones, some of the phones exploded and other electronics, which was a devastating blow to Hezbollah. And we saw this on the backs of what's going on in Gaza. And it demonstrated an exhibition of Israeli power, just raw power, that we hadn't seen before, both Gaza and what was going on in Lebanon. And it clearly indicated that Hezbollah hadn't grown with the times in the same way. It believed that its rocketry would be enough to really intimidate Israel and cause Israel not to invade Lebanon. That's what many leaders of Hezbollah believed, and its supporters believed it, that they could protect Lebanon with their missile technology. And that turned out to be false. Lebanon is getting pounded like Gaza did, and Israel has been dominating and has thrown Hezbollah for a complete loop. Now, I got a lot of criticism for this because many people said, well, that's irrelevant because Hezbollah cannot be destroyed by assassinating its top leadership. And that's true. Resistance is not over. Hezbollah can rebuild itself. I don't think that Lebanese society and politics are in a position to remake. Right now, as we record this, Carnegie Foundation is having a number of people on to talk about the new opportunities in the Middle East that this has created. And that's the new line from America and Israel, is that we're birthing a new Middle East, and we're actually building something better. Well, that's just pure propaganda as far as I can tell. It's not going to build a better Middle East. I don't think Lebanon's politicians are going to rise to the occasion and fix their political problems, and nor are they going to be able to sweep Hezbollah out of the center of Lebanese politics. So, yes, this is an incredible display of Israeli and American power. In the end, it's not going to make a better Middle East, I don't believe, but it is an extraordinary display of power. And I don't think we can avoid that fact because it changes realities in the Middle East.
So there are a number of points in your 5 key takeaways that we'll go through, but just to drill in a little bit on this one. All of the Middle East is an outgrowth of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and an attempt by colonial powers, especially Britain, to refashion the region along nationalist lines. And within these nation states, you have different sects, and you've had sectarian conflict, and Lebanon is a great example of that. And there are unique facets of its government that reflect the different sects and groupings within Lebanese society that we're not going to have a chance to get into here. But recognizing those complexities, I'm curious to understand what it would take. Is it something that the United States and Israel can play a constructive role towards? What it would take to actually help strengthen the Lebanese government and not fall back into a situation where the most powerful group operating within the government is actually a separate political entity in and of itself with its own paramilitary organization, and that's also heavily sectarian in the case of Hezbollah, Shia-oriented. I mean, is there some way to rebuild Lebanon? Because obviously it is in the best interest of the Israelis long-term to have a secure nation state on their northern border that they can negotiate with, and not the conditions that they've had since the 1980s. Right.
Well, to be as brief as I can, the U.S. has tried since 9/11. In the last 2 decades, the U.S. has tried to re-engineer the Middle East, and in particular when George Bush, the son, came to power after 9/11 and decided to invade Iraq. The idea being that America could create a better government for Iraq, one based on power sharing between Shiites, Sunni Arabs, and Kurds. But by getting rid of Saddam Hussein, America didn't create a better mousetrap. The entire state collapsed. American power flailed. And what it did is it sparked in a very, very destructive civil war. The same dynamic happened in Syria with the Arab Spring uprising in Syria, and America jumped in on the side of the Syrian opposition. And it sparked a devastating civil war, which is not really over. Syria is now divided into three major administrative units, one dominated by Turkey, another by the US, and the other by Assad with his Iranian and Russian backing. So Syria is devastated today. 90% live in poverty. Nothing good has come out of all of America's efforts. And we've seen the same thing repeated in Libya and other places. America is not today a force for good in the Middle East. Its efforts to, nation build and to regime change were not a good, constructive effort, not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq, not in Syria. So I think we have to start from admitting that. Now, how can what could America do to diffuse some of these sectarian differences, which make these Middle Eastern countries very weak and undermine their ability to respond effectively to regional changes? And that was one of my points. I believe that was the third point or something like that, which is that Middle Eastern states have been very ineffective because they're so divided. I think diffusing the conflict in the region is the best thing. This is going to take time for these states to overcome their deep sectarian ethnic divisions within them. You need stability, the governments that can fumble through to create a common sense of national belonging. And that's going to take decades. It took decades in Europe. It's going to take decades in the Middle East because these are very new countries, as you said. So the way that to do that is not to try to destroy your enemies like Iran and really make your friends like Israel muscle-bound, which is what America's policy is today. It is to try to find a compromise. And that's something the United States has not done. The United States has helped Israel keep territory that it has conquered on the battlefield, whether it's the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai from Egypt. But the Sinai, of course, was returned at Camp David, and that's kept Egypt out of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Egypt has been at peace with Israel. But the Palestinians have not been given their land back. They don't have self-determination. They live under military rule, a very unjust military rule. And this has caused endless conflict. And America thought that it could just sweep the Palestinian issue under the rug. Israel thought, because it's so powerful, that it could pursue the Abraham Accords, make peace with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arabs, who are the ones that count because they have all the money from the American point of view, and that you could make peace between the Gulf Arabs and Israel and forget the Palestinians, that was yesterday's news. And it turned out not to be yesterday's news. We can't defeat our enemies. We're going to have to make peace with them. And that's what President Obama tried to do with the Iran deal that President Trump overturned. And we're seeing now, again, a new chapter in the United States trying to win this war on the battlefield and helping Israel to take new land in Lebanon and Gaza. And the settler movement in Israel is gearing up to try to settle Gaza, and it might well do it under this new government. But also, Israelis are beginning to talk about keeping parts of Lebanon in the south. And we don't know where that's going to go, but it could, if this is an analog of 1967 and 1973 and so forth, it could end up with Israel acquiring more territory and America defending that.
So you mentioned a number of things that I'd like to get into. One is the Abraham Accords, and another one is a somewhat of an analog that speaks to the return of the Sinai to the Egyptians, which was the 1979 Camp David Accords between Anwar Sadat, who was subsequently killed by a radical within his own country, and I think it was Menachem Begin, who was his counterpart at the time. And Begin was, by any contemporary usage of the term, an extremist. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he was wanted by the United Nations for terrorism, for his role in the bombing of the King David Hotel, which was the British administrative headquarters for Mandatory Palestine in 1946.
Right.
And so you had this
World War II.
Right. You had this historic peace between two individuals that may not initially appear to be people that would have been peacemakers. And I brought that, right. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind as we move forward, because Netanyahu and some of his more radical religious cabinet members could fall in the same category, whether it's Smotrich or Ben-Gvir. So those are things I want to talk about, but I just want to tie the knot on this conversation about Lebanon, because I know it sounds naive. I'm aware of it. I'm not suggesting that this is reasonable, and the smartest people I know don't necessarily suggest it is, but I'm just trying to understand why it isn't. So, and when I say why it isn't, I mean this idea that somehow the United States can play a constructive role with Lebanon, whereas it couldn't play that constructive role in the case of Syria and Iraq. And I think one key difference to highlight is that in those two cases, the United States was engaging in regime change, whereas in Lebanon, the idea would be to strengthen the confessional government that already exists in Lebanon, that has, albeit a very imperfect distribution or allocation of representation along sectarian lines, at least as it was before the 1982 invasion by Israel and the subsequent civil war. So those do seem to be fundamentally different cases, but what would make it difficult for the U.S. to play the role of helping Lebanon's actual government to re-strengthen and to reclaim sovereignty over its boundaries, in your view? Like, what are the things that make that very difficult?
Well, Lebanon's demographic problem is that it's divided into thirds. A third of the population are Christian, roughly, a third Sunni Arab, and a third Shiite Arab. And the Shiites live in the south, and by and large, they support Hezbollah and another political party, Amal. And the head of Amal, Nabi Berri, is Speaker of the Parliament. So Parliament can't meet unless he calls it to meet. Lebanon has not had a president who has to be a Maronite Christian for 2 years. There's a caretaker government in place, but it hasn't been able to agree on the next president because there's such deep differences between these three different groups. Now, also at play is who has more influence in Lebanon? Syria and Iran, or America and Israel? Now, America and Israel are trying to, in a sense, pull Lebanon away from Iran and Syria and bring it into the orbit of the United States and Israel. And in order to do that, they need to destroy Hezbollah, rebuild the Lebanese army with an agreement between the Christians and the Sunnis. But of course, constitutionally, you need the Shiites to agree. And just killing Hezbollah and destroying all of their facilities isn't going to make them more amenable, because you can't kill them all. That's the problem. And Iran and Syria are not going to give up their influence. What you really need, of course, is to solve the Palestinian problem, have a ceasefire in Gaza so that Hezbollah will not attack Israel. This would be to have a regional agreement that would defang Hezbollah. Then Hezbollah and the Shiites and the Christians and the Sunnis would be able to move forward in some kind of a constitutional arrangement. What the America and Israel are trying to do is to use military power in order to short circuit this dialogue, destroy Hezbollah and Iranian influence, and remake the Middle East. And I just don't believe that they can do it. And they won't do it in part because the Sunni Arabs are divided over the Palestinian issue. They don't like Hezbollah, but at the same time, they don't want to be on the side of Israel to destroy their own fellow Lebanese. And that's what America and Israel are asking them to do. They're thinking, let's divide Lebanon, and maybe we can capture 2/3 in our favor against the 1/3. And that's just not going to work constitutionally, because you need each third to be, pulling the oar in the same direction. And Iran and Syria are going to get in there just the way they did after 1982. And they're going to try to scuttle this effort to pull Lebanon away from their orbit into the American-Israeli orbit. And as long as there's not a resolution to the Palestinian conflict, it's very hard to see. Lebanon is trapped in the middle of this regional geopolitical tug of war. And using military force to try to kill the team on one side of that rope isn't going to work. It didn't work in 82. America tried to do it again with George Bush after 9/11, when America invaded Iraq and it tried to pull Hariri away from the Syrian orbit and the Iranian orbit. And what happened? Hariri was assassinated we believe, by Hezbollah people. And this whole effort collapsed. And Lebanon went back into the orbit of Iran and Syria. So, yes, perhaps Israel can bomb Iran and kill a lot of its leadership, but it's not going to destroy Iran. And Iran is still going to fight with Syria not to allow Israel to remake the Middle East and America remake the Middle East. And Lebanon is trapped. It's very weak. It's poor. It's divided. Its politicians are corrupt. It's going to be very difficult for the United States to solve this problem, which it hasn't solved. It's tried twice before, in 82 and with the Hariri moment, and it's failed both times. And why this time it's going to work, I just don't see why it's going to work.
When was Hariri, 2009 or 2008?
Hariri was assassinated in 2004-5. There's Tamdid Lahoud, the Syrians. America told Syria not to extend the presidency beyond one presidency of Lahoud. Syria defied the United States and extended his presidency. Then the United States and the West encouraged Hariri to then go against Syria and Hezbollah. Because America had occupied Iraq, we were saying, we're going to rebuild the Middle East. This is the moment. And Hariri was forced to decide. He went with America, and he was assassinated. And then the whole Sunni Arab effort collapsed. And then in the Arab Spring, 2011, America tried to side with the Syrian rebels and overthrow Assad. This spooked the Christians. And the Christians, many of the Lebanese Christians, in a sense, sided with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah and the Christians feared an Islamist takeover of Syria, that the rebels would be run by people like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and that they would take over, and then they would come over and take over Lebanon and kill the Christians. So the Christians freaked out, and many of them backed Hezbollah in fighting the Syrian opposition and joined behind Bashar al-Assad. Now, they hate, but most of them dislike Bashar al-Assad intensely. They dislike Hezbollah. But it shows you how the Lebanese kaleidoscope and the interests of the Christians, Sunni Arabs, and Shiites can switch in different combinations pretty quickly. And America's counting on being able to really turn those tables and get the Sunnis and the Christians to work together against the Shiites. But as long as Lebanese are not cooperating together, all three groups, you really can't make Lebanon work unless it's through a military solution, a coup or something like that. But, the whole point is that Lebanon should have a constitutional agreement between these three different groups.
Which they did, but it created a lot of problems. I think the Sunnis had, more power within the political structure relative to the Shia as part of a Muslim minority within the confessional government. I can't quite remember.
In 1943, the National Pact, France was the colonial power. It was in charge of the mandate from the League of Nations, and it ruled Lebanon. And it helped the Christians get the lion's share of power. So in 1943, The National Pact was predicated on 6 Christian deputies to 5 Muslim deputies in parliament. Now, there was 100 seats roughly, but it was a Christian majority. The president, which was strong originally, was going to be a Maronite Christian.
And there were how many Maronite Christians living in Lebanon at the time?
In Lebanon, in the last census ever taken in Lebanon is 1932 under the French mandate, where there was a slight majority of Christians over Muslims. There has never been another census because the Muslims have become the majority. And the Christians are perhaps only a third of the population. Now, in 1990, after the long Lebanese civil war that broke out in 1975 over this question of representation and who's going to have the lion's share of power, and the Muslims demanded one person, one vote. We want to have the lion's share of power because they were the majority population. And they were a majority population in part because 200,000 Palestinian were driven into Lebanon in 1948 when Israel conquered Palestine and drove the Palestinians out, 800,000 out, and almost 200,000 went to Lebanon. Almost all of them are Sunni Muslims, Sunni Arabs. And this changed the demographic balance and the military balance inside Lebanon, leading to the civil war in 75, And then in 1990, you had the Taif Accords. And in order to bring an end to the civil war, all the living deputies, about 70, were flown to Taif in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, Americans, with an Israel okay, sat down to rebuild a consensus. And they came up with a 50-50 power sharing. In other words, 50% of the deputies would be Christian, 50% would be Muslim, including the Druze. And that meant Shiites got about 22% of the seats and Sunni Arabs 22%, while the Christians were getting 50%. So it still isn't equal. But in order to make up for that, the main power was shifted from the president, which was Maronite, to the prime minister, who was a Sunni. So the prime minister is really the power in this troika of Christian president, Sunni prime minister, Shiite speaker of the House, the speaker of the parliament. And so they each have their power, but the Sunnis were supposed to have more power, which was going to balance it out. But the trouble was that in 1990, Syria was really a power in Lebanon, and Syria allowed the Shiites, Hezbollah, to keep their arms and to be a militia. All the other militias were disarmed. And that has set the stage for what we see today, because Hezbollah is muscle bound, and it has its guns and it has its missiles launched at Israel, and it's saying it's allied with the Palestinians, and it's part of this axis of resistance that Iran is, running, and allied with Syria and Iran. And so that's what America and Israel are trying to defeat. And they're trying to put a good face on it by saying we're going to remake a better Lebanon. But it's hard to believe that they can do that. They can destroy a lot of stuff and hurt Hezbollah badly, but Iran and Syria will be able to rebuild it in the future. I mean, what's the only thing that will stop them from rebuilding it is if the United States can build up the Lebanese army, get the Christians and Sunnis to agree, and ultimately convince the Shiites to abandon Hezbollah. But how do you do that? It's very difficult in a world that's very sectarian to rearrange everything on the battlefield like that.
So all of that is something I think we can talk about in the second hour, because that's where I want to discuss the Abraham Accords and other avenues of regional cooperation and collaboration that might lead the Middle East away from some of the darker scenarios that many historians and experts on the region like you believe are likely. I had a bunch of questions I was going to ask about Hezbollah, but I'm just going to forget about them for now because we have a limited amount of time, and I want to focus on areas that are most relevant. Let's shift to Israel-Palestine. Before I ask you about the situation in Gaza, just on a high level, I'm curious, do you think that there are problems for which there are no solutions, or at the very least, there might be theoretical solutions, but in practice, there basically aren't? And that the only solution comes with time. And in the meanwhile, you just have to make do with the status quo. Is that your view of the situation that Israel finds itself in, not just with the Palestinians, but in its larger regional setting?
I do. The train that's running down the track, it's out of control, is a Palestinian issue. There are 7 million Palestinians in historic Palestine today, and 5 million of those live under military occupation. 5-point-something million Palestinians live under military occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. They have no rights. Many people call it an apartheid regime. And the point is that the Palestinians have few rights. They don't control their water, their ground, their air, their land. They can't build houses. There's great inequality. And this has caused constant uprisings, whether it's the Intifada in 1987, the second Intifada in 2000, the outbreaks in Gaza, which have been repeated. And their last one is, the October 7th is only the most dramatic. But it's been boiling because the Palestinians don't have self-determination. And today, the obvious solution to that was a two-state solution in which Israel would give up the occupied territories, that means the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, to a Palestinian authority, and that would become a national authority and have its own independence. That never happened. That was the promise of Oslo Accords in 1993, but it was an unfulfilled promise. Israel did not move out. Instead, Israel has moved 700,000 Israeli settlers into those occupied territories. And that's the unresolved problem that you just spoke about. How do you solve this Palestinian issue?
So just to clarify this point, when I describe the problem, I don't just mean that there is a long-standing grievance on the part of the Palestinians that's been aggravated over the course of many generations, not just because of the exodus resulting from the partition of Palestine and the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but in all the subsequent conflicts and bloodshed, including the most recent one in Gaza. That's the Palestinian side of the problem. Then there's the Israeli perspective, putting aside the fact that alternative factions led by folks like Netanyahu have done things to actively undermine the peace process and the hopes for a Palestinian state on the part of some Israelis by supporting organizations like Hamas. There is a legitimate concern on the part of the Israelis about what it would mean to create a Palestinian state and whether they can actually trust the Palestinian leadership to provide a security guarantee to Israel that factions within their own nation won't use that state to launch future terror attacks at Israel. So what I'm basically trying to highlight and clarify is that this is one of those wicked problems where it isn't just the Israelis not being able to give the Palestinians a state because they just want the territory for themselves, but that there are legitimate concerns that doing so would be bad for Israel's long-term security, even though the origins of the conflict stem from Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. And so I just wanted to highlight that this is really the problem I was trying to address.
Right. Well, and that is the Israeli argument. And it's, we can't trust the Arabs because there's moments like October 7th, and there are groups like Hamas, which are determined to turn the tables on Israel and are looking for a future. And that's true. There is this insecurity because there are groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, and ultimately Iran. And as Netanyahu is constantly hammering away, it's Iran, Iran, Iran. We have to have regime change in Iran. Because until we do that, there's going to be this malevolent, malignant forces.
And yet solving the Palestinian conflict could in fact result in regime change in Iran that doesn't require the force of the Israelis or the Americans.
Well, but let's avoid the regime change in Iran because that just opens a whole can of worms. The point is that I would make here is that Iran would have no purchase and Hamas would have no purchase or little purchase over the Palestinians were there an alternative. And we saw in 1992-3 with the Oslo Accords and the meetings in Madrid and so forth, there was great excitement that there could be a two-state solution and that they were going to move towards it through negotiations and diplomacy. The PLO forswore military force, said we recognize Israel and let's negotiate. And they set up in the West Bank and have been a partner to Israel. The trouble is they couldn't deliver a state. And this gave great credibility to Hamas, which was constantly saying, Jews are evil. You can't negotiate with them. America and Israel are going to constantly undermine us. And the PLO has just been duped. Because today it looks like it has been duped. And this has caused many Palestinians who were very in favor of the two-state solution to abandon it and to now call for a one-state solution or support Hamas. And Iran. Iran would, forget Iran's revolutionary ideology and anti-Israel ideology, which it's exploiting for various regional and geostrategic reasons. Iran would not be a major force in the region were there some reasonable solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, because the Palestinians wouldn't move towards, wouldn't side with Iran. It's not natural for the Sunni Arab Palestinians to be allied with Shiite Iran or the Shiite Lebanese. They do it because they believe that a negotiated solution is not at hand. And, the second question then is, what's the proof that Arabs can be trusted? Because Netanyahu's argument is that Arabs can't be trusted. They're savage. When he came to US Congress and got 55 standing ovations, he hammered away at the argument that this is not a clash of civilizations, he said. This is a clash between civilization and barbarism. He painted the Arabs as savages and that you can't negotiate with them. And that's the argument of his government.
And that's an argument that's gained more resonance, or it's resonated with a larger number of Israelis since the second Intifada, isn't it? In other words, the whole of society has moved more towards Netanyahu's position than it was in the 1990s.
That is true. And America at each step of the way has refused to put pressure on Israel, whether it was to stop settlement process after the 67 war, whether it was to change to really move forward with the Land for Peace at 224, the UN resolution that was passed after the 67 war, when Israel conquered so much Arab territory. The United States at each step refused to pressure Israel into giving up that land and negotiating seriously. Israel learned at each step of the way that there was a military solution, that it could just take that land and absorb it into Israel. Now, this, of course, kept the Arabs radicalized and didn't de-radicalize them. The proof that Arabs can be de-radicalized and accept a negotiated solution is one, Egypt did it. 1979 with the Camp David Accords, Sadat made peace got to sign his land back, Egypt's land back, and Egypt has been at peace and a partner with Israel ever since 79. Jordan made peace, resolved this land disputes, and has been at peace, even though 60% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian and is dead set, it feels their hearts are bleeding for their brethren in Gaza and the West Bank. They have remained loyal to their government and they have been at peace with Israel. Take the 2 million Palestinians that live inside Israel and that gained Israeli citizenship, but are still second-class citizens inside Israel because they're not Jews. They're at peace. They haven't been carrying out terrorist actions against the Jewish state, even though they are very distressed at what's happening in Gaza and are just, fraught with internal divisions about their relationship to the Jewish state. They've remained loyal. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that peace and compromise is a possibility. Arabs are not fanatical because of their DNA, because of their lack of civilization. They're radical because there isn't a way forward like a two-state solution. It's been foreclosed. Syria is radical because Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, a big hunk of Syrian territory. And this is what's radicalizing. Now, Iran has got its own issues, but Iran can exploit that dissatisfaction. If there wasn't dissatisfaction to exploit, nobody would care about Iran. In the same way that people like Gaddafi tried to fund Black Americans during the 1970s and 80s, Nation of Islam. Farah Khan, for example, would go to Libya and get money from Libya. But he could do that, he could get away with that only because Black Americans felt very badly discriminated against in the United States. As soon as there is civil rights movement, as you move forward, as Blacks see that there's an option inside America that isn't based on conflict, they didn't want to go with Gaddafi. They haven't been turned against the American government, either by Soviet Russia during the Cold War or by Libya or by any other squirrely power that's trying to radicalize them, because there's been a way forward towards equality within America. It hasn't been quick, it hasn't been easy, but there's been a way forward. And that's the argument, the liberal argument for a peace solution rather than using brute force. And Israel's effort to solve its land problems by using brute force has only exacerbated its own situation with its neighbors. It's undermined American foreign policy in the region. It's our attempts to bring peace between the Gulf Arabs and Israel. And it's undermined our position in the international community of upholding international law, because we haven't upheld international law when it comes to Israel. So, that would be the argument, the liberal argument.
Okay, so before I go to my next question, I just want to clarify 2 points. Earlier, when I said that a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is more likely to affect regime change in Tehran, what I meant was exactly what you said, which is that the modus vivendi of the Iranian regime is in part animated by external enemies in the narrative of death to Israel and Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. So solving that problem makes it more difficult for the Iranian regime to focus its energies outwards as a distraction for its failures internally.
Right. And Iran's big argument is that the Palestinians are oppressed, right? They say that was Khomeini's big argument for overthrowing the Shah. The Shah is oppressing Muslims, and he's oppressing the average Iranian. He's a dictator, blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, the regime of the mullahs is oppressive in its own right, but it maintains this argument that it's on the side of the oppressed. The Palestinians are oppressed. We're on the side of the Palestinians. Zionism is inherently racist because it's for the Jews over the Arabs. There's not equality in Israel.
Right, because there's so much in Iran.
Right. Well, that's the argument, right? And it's an argument that gains purchase with the Palestinians because they feel oppressed. And if you could take away that oppression, everybody will look at Iran as being a hypocritical nation that's just blowing hot air. But they aren't looking at it that way. Many Middle Easterners don't look at it that way because there is oppression of the Palestinians. So, that would be the way to denature Iran and to have it lose its purchase over this Arab populations.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The second thing that I wanted to address with you has to do with the argument that Arabs cannot live in peace. Your counterexamples of Palestinians making up a majority of people in Jordan or who peacefully coexist within Israel are good ones. But they don't get to the question of whether or not that majority is able to restrain the remaining revisionist elements within Palestinian society that are interested in continuing the fight. This goes back to my earlier point about whether or not a Palestinian state has the political consensus to manage its internal security and provide security guarantees to an Israeli state, which is something that the Lebanese government has struggled to do. Granted, Lebanon may represent an even more difficult challenge in that regard because of the different sects that make it up. So again, this brings us back to this being a wicked problem. And I just wanted to reemphasize that. I'm going to hold off my question on what's going on in Gaza because a lot of people can read about it, but it's a massacre, what's going on over there. We can talk about whether or not it's a genocide or whether it qualifies as ethnic cleansing. I think one could make the argument that the end game for Netanyahu's government and those who support him is to expel the remaining Palestinians from Gaza by whatever means necessary. And I'm basing this not just on their actions, but also on the statements being made by ministers within Netanyahu's own government. Before we explore that line of reasoning, I'm curious to ask you if you feel like most Americans who are, say, in their 40s or 50s or older, have a view of Israel that is informed by or stuck in the period of the Oslo Accords and the efforts to establish a Palestinian state. And if that's true, if that's the framing that many Americans have, how out of date is that with the present state of Israeli politics and Israeli attitudes towards the prospects of a Palestinian state?
Yes, I think Americans are at heart very pro-Israel. Every American has Jewish friends and knows Jews, and Jews have been extraordinarily successful Americans. They've been the most successful Americans. They have the highest per capita income. They're the best educated. 92% of American Jews go to four-year universities. 1/3 of the top Fortune 100 companies are the chief operating officers are Jewish. Jews have just been extraordinarily successful Americans, and Americans like that. So, yes, America is very pro-Israel. And, of course, there's the whole religious reasons for being pro-Jewish is that the Jews are the chosen people according to American religious thinking, and Muslims are not. Muhammad, from a Christian point of view, Muhammad is just a faker, and the Quran is not descended from heaven, whereas the Old Testament is, and the New Testament is. And so there is a brotherhood, a natural brotherhood, whether it's religiously, whether it's socially, politically, between Christians and Jews and amongst Americans in this way, that Muslims just can't penetrate today, even though there is a growing Muslim community in the United States. But we see in this election, Muslim Americans they don't have any purchase. If you look at the billionaire donors to both parties, which are all declared, over half are Jewish donors. There are no Arab donors in the top 25 donors to political parties in the 2022 cycle or in the present cycle. Arabs just don't show up as big money givers to either political party. So America is connected at the hip with Israel. And that explains a lot of why America has sided with Israel in each of the wars, has not held its feet to the fire on these negotiations and international law, and has allowed Israel to expand its territory over East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Golan, and so forth, and now in Lebanon and in Gaza. And Israel has grown used to this and has realized that it can use increasing levels of military might and has been extraordinarily successful instead of compromising. And that leads to a situation which is very hard to reverse today because there's so many settlements. Israel's not going to pull out of the West Bank. And it gets America caught in a struggle which is only in the middle of the road. And America's firmly on the side of Israel in this struggle, and it's going to remain that way, I think. And that brings us back to your earlier question of, how we're stuck in this hurtling train that's hitting a stone wall. And how do you overcome the Palestinian issue or resolve it? And I don't see a good resolution.
So I want to remain here a little bit before we switch to the second hour, Joshua, because I think this is where a conversation about Israel-Palestine often goes off the rails, insofar as it loses one side or the other because of how much emotion is understandably wrapped up in this issue. Before I continue, I want to mention a great conversation I had with Walter Russell Mead not long after October 7th, which speaks to something we were talking about earlier, where we discussed the close alliance between the evangelicals in the United States and the Zionists in Israel. You mentioned the power of the Jewish diaspora. As a Greek citizen, I'm familiar with the important role that the Greek diaspora played in Greece's national project that led to the founding of the Hellenic Republic following the Greek War of Independence. These are historical facts that are part of the story of how the former Ottoman-controlled lands were carved up and turned into nation states, many of which internalized sectarian conflicts that have to this day remained unresolved. And the creation of Israel falls within this category. So my point is also that you don't just get to have a nation state. You have to earn it. You have to be willing to fight for it, and you have to be able to build a political consensus to rule over it and show that you have the leadership ability to do that. And the Israelis have been able to do that. And while the Palestinians have also shown a willingness to fight, they have been less effective and successful on the political side and in finding the right people to lead them toward a shared positive vision of a Palestinian future and one that can coexist alongside Israel. And so that, again, brings us back to the wicked problem that exists between the Israelis and the Palestinians that I mentioned earlier. So one more question for you, Joshua, before we switch to the second hour. And that has to do with this observation about Americans being stuck in the period of the Oslo Accords and how Israeli society has moved much more to the right since then. I, too, I must admit, was someone that didn't realize just how far right Israeli society has moved in the intervening decades, and was shocked to learn that Netanyahu has people in his administration, in his government, like Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who used to have a picture of Baruch Goldstein hanging in his family living room. And for those who don't know, Goldstein is a Jewish terrorist who opened fire on hundreds of Palestinian Muslim worshippers during the month of Ramadan, killing 29 of them. And the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, was arrested nearly, I think, 20 years ago on suspicion of plotting to blow up one of Israel's major highways and was found with something like 700 liters of gasoline. Do you think that people understand just how significant the shift in Israeli politics has been? Because for me, as someone who's not an expert in the region but has followed it over the decades, this seems like a pretty radical change in leadership.
It is a radical change. And the government of Netanyahu today, in this coalition with all the right-wing parties, is dedicated. Their first plank is that there should be no Palestinian state and that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, should be annexed to Israel. And that's their goal. That means moving more settlements, building more settlements. The Palestinians are not indigenous people. They are foreigners on Jewish land. And that this week, there was a big conference on settlement in Gaza, in which both Smotrich and Ben-Gvir spoke at great length to the settler movement, saying, we have to settle Gaza and we have to get rid of the Palestinians. And Israel will never be secure until Gaza is completely Jewish and the Palestinian population has been driven out. So that isn't just an extremist wing of the Israeli government. That's become this sort of central effort on the part of this government, and Netanyahu backs it. Now, he says he's not in favor of getting rid of the Palestinians, but after October 7th, he went to Egypt, he went to the United States, he carried his message around to the various neighboring nations saying, would you take the Gazans? He tried to negotiate a Gazan exodus so that Palestinians could be gotten rid of from Gaza and replaced with Israelis. So they're in the same page, more or less. Netanyahu has spent a lifetime dedicated to defeating both the Oslo Accords as well as any effort to create a Palestinian state inside historic Palestine. So he's not that different from these radicals. And that's his life's mission. And he's over 70 now. This is his closing chapter. And he is doing everything he can to make sure that he can defeat the creation of a Palestinian state, keep the Palestinians divided. And that's why the big effort to hit Lebanon and to hit Iran, because he sees those as the keys to any potential Western effort to side with the Palestinians. Because if you can denature Iran and Hezbollah, then the Palestinians are really a piece of cake. They won't have anybody to stand up for them in the international arena. And that's what's going on in Israel. And the United States is backing this effort because our system is at a very weak moment in the election cycle where both candidates are competing against each other to be more pro-Israeli than the other. And so Netanyahu understands this, and he's done an end run around American politics. He's got Congress very much pro-Israeli, and he's got both candidates, and particularly President Trump, who constantly is complaining that Harris is too anti-Israel, is trying to restrain Netanyahu, and she shouldn't be restraining him. She should be siding with him ever more strongly, and that he would do that. So that's the logic in American politics, and it's empowering Netanyahu to continue on this strain, and it's convincing many Israelis, he can get away with it. Brute force can solve this problem.
So we're going to have a chance to talk more about Netanyahu in the second hour, because he isn't just being driven by his own ideological beliefs that he's held for most of his career. There's also political calculus that requires him to maintain the support of his coalition, which includes far-right members, in order to avoid early elections, because also he has his own legal issues that he was battling before October 7th, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. In the second hour, I just want to tell people where we're going to take this conversation. I do want to continue with some specific cases, like, for example, the recorded cases of settler violence in the West Bank since October 7th, because I think that's also important to understand, because this is such a complicated picture. And one can acknowledge the legitimate challenges that the real external threats that Israeli society faces, as well as the actions that elements and groups within Israel take that undermine their security, or one could argue that undermine the security. And in point of fact, the case of settler violence is one of those, because I think it was Ronan Bar, the head of Israel's General Security Service, that actually criticized this specific situation in the West Bank because he felt that it was undermining Israel's security. And he's, of course, at odds with some of the people on Israel's right. The same goes for the head of the IDF with respect to the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza, which was supposed to be part of the negotiation for a ceasefire. And that also has created schisms between the defense establishment, which also, by the way, seems a little bit, it reminds me a bit of the break between the Kemalists and the Erdoganists in Turkey. And maybe those are parallels that we can draw in the second hour. And then I want to talk about what it would take to reach a political settlement in the context of the Abraham Accords, and then the Abraham Accords in the context of America's larger desire for a geostrategic pivot to Asia, Joshua. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Dr. Landis, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Dr. Landis, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.
Very good.
If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.